Ready or not, here I come, coming at you with another one. This is Professor Tatum with another lecture for History 1301. Here we're looking at colonial competition in North America in the Spanish and French empires. We'll be looking at a little context as usual. Then we'll look at some territorial claims from some of the major empires in North America. Then we'll look at some key characteristics of Spanish colonization and see how they compare to key characteristics of early French colonization in North America. We got to remember that when Spain had first sent Columbus's voyages here to the islands in the Caribbean, and then eventually went in and conquered the Aztecs in Mexico and the Incas in Peru, and began establishing claims throughout Central and South America, they were gaining all kinds of wealth and resources in the process, and began to expand further out into the Americas, looking for a new Mexico or a new Peru, okay, looking for access to new colonies to where they could extract valuable resources like those they found down here. Furthermore, we need to remember that as other European nations caught wind of what Spain was doing here and saw them obtaining all that great wealth, they started rushing in as well to try to carve out a piece of the pie. All right, we had the Russians up in the Northwest getting involved with things like the sea otter fur trade. You had the French coming in, the English, the Dutch, not shown on this map as I've mentioned before. The Portuguese were down here in South America. So all kinds of powers from all over Europe began coming into the Americas, trying to stake claims in various regions and carve up a piece of the pie by extracting various resources as well as labor from Native American peoples. The driving force of this contest for power between these various European nations who were rushing in to stake claim in the Americas was a concept known as mercantilism. And I know some people hear those words Indianism and they say, oh no, this is a big, intimidating term. I can't handle this. Guys, I promise you, it's not that bad. I'll do the best I can to break it down simply for you. All right. There's two key points to mercantilism we need to understand. It is overall an economic theory that number one is based on the belief that there is a limited amount of wealth or resources. All right. Think about it like if you and your friends order a big, nice, tasty pizza, and one of your friends eats a couple slices, and then somebody else goes and gets another slice, and then somebody else goes and gets another slice. Well, that pizza's running out pretty quickly. It's becoming a limited resource, so you know you better run in there and grab a slice if you want one, right? That's kind of the first part of mercantilism here, is this idea that there's a limited amount of wealth or resources. And we can see that when people believe that there's a limited amount of wealth and resources, they can rush out in masses and do all kinds of crazy things to try to get a hold of some of those. We can look at some examples from more recent history here in the United States. Popeyes, back in about 2018, 2019, somewhere around there, released their chicken sandwich, and people flocked to Popeyes all over the country, lining up around the blocks. People were camping out, doing all kinds of crazy things, posting this all over social media. Why were people rushing so much to get this chicken sandwich? Let me tell you, I love Popeyes as much as anyone else, but when I got around to trying this thing, my overall impression was this is a very good sandwich, but these people clearly don't eat enough Popeyes. All right, it tastes just like everything else on the menu. Tastes like a little grease, a little crisp, a little Cajun seasoning, and what God, I hope is chicken on the inside. I try not to think too much about what I'm eating when I'm eating fast food. But regardless, the reason people were flocking to get this chicken sandwich and going so nuts over it is because they were under the impression that it was a limited resource. Okay, this was first intended to be something that would only be on the menu for a limited amount of time. And because it was such a limited resource that people valued, everybody was willing to go line up, post about it, be all about this sandwich. Same thing happened not long after with Taco Bell's Mexican pizza. They took it off the menu for a while, and everybody was so upset, posting about it, blah blah blah, having a fit. And then they released it, originally planning to only release it for a temporary amount of time. And again, they suffered from the same problems as Popeyes. They were meeting such high demands that they couldn't keep up with it. They kept running out of it. People were posting about it all over social media. Why? Again, it was a limited resource. Now both of these things are on the menu full times. I hope y'all feel good about yourselves, lining up and making fools about yourselves over sandwiches and Mexican pizzas. Oh boy. Then did we see this during the COVID-19 pandemic, when people began to believe that resources like toilet paper may become limited, and that manufacturers may, for whatever reason, decide that they can no longer make us toilet paper and send them to the stores because there's a virus out there. Doesn't really add up, but that was people's justification for going and ripping all the toilet paper off the shelf, leaving the rest of us struggling to wipe our shoes. Excuse me. We see here, though, the wild things that people are willing to do if they believe that there's a limited amount of resources. Okay, and that kind of helps us understand that piece of mercantilism. This belief that in the Americas there's only so much wealth there, and everybody's rushing in to try to get as much of that wealth as they can before anybody else does. The goal of mercantilism, okay, this is the second part of mercantilism, is to create a favorable balance of trade. And all that means is having people more dependent on you than you depend on them. Right? So, in other words, you have so much wealth and resources that you're selling more to other countries than you're having to buy from them. You're exporting more to other countries than you're having to import from them. You've got the majority of wealth and resources, so everybody else is more dependent on you. That's the goal of mercantilism. Okay, so two key points once again: belief in a limited amount of resources, trying to get a hold of as much of those limited resources as possible in order to, number two, create that favorable balance of trade. This is what's driving the rush to North America from all these European empires. And in order to acquire this wealth and resources and create this favorable balance of trade, they began establishing colonies in North America. So I've learned over my years of teaching so far that a lot of earlier levels of education don't maybe clarify too clearly to students what exactly a colony is. Some students think it's just a settlement, just a town, just a place where people live. That's all a part of it. But a colony, very specifically, is an extension of an empire. Okay, usually a very distant extension of an empire. In most cases, it's not geographically connected to the colonizing country. Okay, so for example, so far we've seen Spain, the mother or colonizing country, establish colonies all the way on the other side of the world here in Mexico and Peru. They're nowhere near each other, Spain, Mexico, and Peru. Yet, Spain, all the way on the other side of the world, is still putting its claim over these territories and extracting resources from these territories and collecting tribute from these territories. That, by nature, there is a colony. Okay. So we can see by this standard that the purpose of a colony as a distant extension of an empire, okay, or a distant extension of a mother country or colonizing country, whatever we want to call it, is to serve that colonizing country. Okay, that's the purpose of a colony. So we see here all these colonies providing all kinds of resources here to the mother country. They're serving it up to her. And we need to keep in mind also, in some cases, the mother country can take some of these things that the colony is providing, all right, things like raw materials, and then manufacture them into more advanced products that they can sell back to the colonies, all right, making more profit for themselves in the process. This definitely all helps create that favorable balance of trade. So we know that there were all kinds of European empires getting involved in this rush for colonization. We had the Russians, the Portuguese, the Swedish, the Dutch, etc. But we're going to focus really on three main empires who were colonizing in North America. We'll be focusing on the English, later known as the British. Just for the sake of simplicity, use those terms interchangeably. It wasn't really till later on the road when they incorporated Scotland and other territories that they became known as Britain. But just for the sake of simplicity, once again, we'll say English and British interchangeably. But then we also have the French and the Spanish. Okay, these are the three main empires we'll be focusing on. The Spanish, as we know, had claims in the Caribbean. They called these the West Indies because remember, Columbus landed there thinking he was in islands outside of India. Those actual islands where he thought he was, we call the East Indies. These are the West Indies. They also had Mexico, which they called New Spain. And they had Peru, expanded further down into South America as well. They had all kinds of territory in South America, but they didn't have Brazil because apparently God wanted the Portuguese to have Brazil. So the Pope signed a treaty saying the Portuguese have Brazil, Spain, y'all can have whatever else you want. Spain also expanded further up here into the North American Southwest, up into California and some of the southern plains here into Texas. Then, of course, they had their settlement in Florida. We saw that Juan Ponce de Leon, the Spanish explorer, had established that first permanent European colony, what would later become the United States, down in St. Augustine, Florida. The French, they started out up here in northeastern Canada and down into the Great Lakes region, which they call New France. Then they settled down a little further west and south as well into Louisiana. And we're talking about Louisiana here. We're not talking about just the little state of Louisiana we know now. We're talking about everything between the Mississippi River and the Rocky Mountains, and even down into parts of Texas here. Big hunk of territory there. Then the English, or later down the road, the British, had their 13 colonies along the eastern seaboard here. And we'll also notice that each of these empires had influences here in the West Indies, okay, so down in the Caribbean, where they were getting a hold of very valuable resources like sugar and molasses. We also see the British Empire had some claims peppered throughout Central America here. So while these claims are all here on paper, we need to be mindful of the reality. A lot of these were sparsely populated, and as much as the empires from the colonizing countries like to think they had firm control over these regions, maybe they'd have control of a settlement here, a settlement there, a settlement there. Especially if we look at like New France and Louisiana, they were very sparsely populated. They only had about 5,000 people populating all this territory here, and all around them were these various groups of indigenous peoples, right, who had been very well settled in this territory for quite some time and had a long history here. So a lot of Europe's ability to colonize and succeed in the Americas is going to have to do with how they interact with Native Americans, okay? In some cases, they would have to depend very heavily on diplomacy with Native Americans. In other cases, they would get into some very brutal warfare in order to be able to stake a claim in certain other territories. So let's start out by examining the Spanish. Spanish motivations for colonization we can see pretty clearly laid out in Columbus's journal from his first voyage. The things that he seemed interested in were based on 3 G's. Those were gold, God, and glory. In terms of gold, we can see that the Spanish were definitely backed by this idea of mercantilism, trying to create that favorable balance of trade, getting a hold of all kinds of valuable resources, which in many cases did actually include gold, silver as well. Remember, a lot of what they're doing as they're colonizing other parts of North America is trying to find a new Mexico or a new Peru where they had found gold and silver. All right, so gold, silver, valuable resources are certainly a key motivator for the Spanish. God also, this has to do with their desire to spread Roman Catholicism to the peoples of North America. We'll definitely see a very strong missionary presence among the Spanish. And then a lot of the colonizers themselves, the conquistadores. Remember people like Hernan Cortez, who we'd seen, or Francisco Pizarro down in Peru, the conquerors who would go in and colonize. They saw themselves as gaining a sense of glory through their conquest and alleged sovereignty over the regions that they were claiming. So when we're trying to understand why the Spanish are coming to North America, these are the key reasons, and these definitely explain why they colonized the way that they did. 2 key methods of Spanish colonization we can see throughout the early colonial period were the encomienda system and the mission system. So the encomienda system, this was a feudalistic type labor system, mirrored feudalism in Europe, which we had talked about briefly before, where European lords would have control over certain subjects and collect tribute from those subjects. The Spanish were implementing very similar practices here in the Americas. Certain prominent Spaniards who were of great wealth or status were called encomenderos, and these encomenderos were granted tracts of land, and they were given control of that land and all the resources in that land, as well as all the people living in that land. And they would subjugate the Native Americans living in that land and demand them to pay tribute, often in the form of forced labor. So we're going to see that the Spanish Empire was largely built on the backs of Native American labor. They would also definitely use a lot of African slavery, as we'll see moving forward in another lecture. But a good deal of the Spanish Empire was built on the backs of American Indian labor as well. Okay, so the mission system was at the heart of Spanish colonization. So here's a photograph I took of a mission in San Antonio, and you can certainly feel it has a lot of spirit to it. If you just allow yourself to walk around quietly, you can feel the walls. I don't know how else to explain it. All kinds of experiences lived in there, both positive and very, very disturbingly negative as well, lived within these walls here. So these missions were big walled-in settlements centered around churches, but they also had various living quarters and other buildings that could serve a variety of purposes. They were in many cases the central settlement in early colonial ventures in North America. So when the Spanish were first establishing a presence in an area, this would kind of be the town center. They were usually stationed nearby presidios or military forts that were armed with things like cannons and guns, and often manned with prisoners and other very tough soldiers who could help protect these mission settlements. Now, these missions had various purposes for the Spanish. The most obvious is religious missionary work. They were centered around churches because there were missionaries there trying to spread the word of God to the native people of the Americas. In addition to missionizing and spreading religion, another goal of these missions was to assimilate Native American peoples into Spanish culture. So they would teach them while they were here how to adopt things like Spanish dress, Spanish customs, and teach them to learn the Spanish language. And as I suggested, they frequently served as town centers. They had a lot of living quarters where, in the early phases of Spanish colonization, people could come and stay here, live here, and operate their colonies out of these missions. But they also served a pretty interesting purpose of thwarting off enemies, both indigenous and other European rivals. So you see here this big walled-in compound accompanied by a fort with cannons and guns. That's sending a clear signal to anybody else coming near this area that the Spanish already have a claim here. So in a sense, we can see that they served kind of as a big beware of dog sign, letting people know, hey, you come in this area, you're gonna have trouble. And as a result, the Spanish would strategically, over time, align their presidios and missions uh, from the east to the west along their northern frontier in a way that helped defend their more valuable colonies further south, especially their silver mines down in Mexico. They wanted to keep protected. So they put the missions and presidios further north to help provide a barrier and let people know if you cross any further south, you're going to have hell to pay. So, how did indigenous peoples respond to these missions? Several ways. We can see on one hand that there were several indigenous peoples who did fall victim to colonialism and were forcibly brought into these missions and forced to assimilate to Spanish Christian culture. But we need to recognize, again, the indigenous peoples as historical actors. We need to recognize what we call their agency, meaning that they were active people with their own lived experiences who were contributing to this historical moment. All right. And if we look at the history that way, we can come to recognize that they, in many cases, used missions to their advantage. They used them as access to things like status and commodity goods, meaning goods that they could use to survive on, goods that they could use to build up social prestige, as well as goods that they could use to trade. They could get these from Spanish missions both through establishing trade networks with the Spanish or by raiding their missions. Other Indian groups would frequently use these to seek refuge from rival indigenous bands who were frequently raiding them. They could also come here to escape things like drought, hunger. Also, as colonialism and raids from enemies would lead to social breakdowns of some societies, and the people who normally cared for the vulnerable members of societies were themselves being killed, here's a space where they could come, seek refuge, get some food, water, shelter, seek a sense of safety. Some of them also came here hoping that perhaps the Spanish god may be able to protect them more so than their own gods had. Pretty interesting, kind of ironic example we can see of indigenous peoples using these missions as a means of protection from enemies in the southwest borderlands. The Pueblos, who we looked at a little bit already, would frequently use missions as a way to come seek protection from Apaches and other nomadic groups in the region. And then later down the road, when the Comanches would start to grow as this great, powerful empire in the southwest borderlands, they outmatched the Apaches by far, and the Apaches would come and start using missions to seek refuge from the Comanches. So that was definitely a prominent use of missions, all right, a sense of protection. Other indigenous peoples, more sedentary groups of people who depended heavily on farming, would come here during drought or during their off season where they couldn't really grow a lot of food, and they would come in and say, "We are here to learn about Jesus. We want to be good Spanish speaking subjects. Teach us and don't forget to feed us." All right. They'd come in, they'd enjoy some shelter, they'd get some food, they'd get through their tough season, or they'd wait for some rainfall. And at night, someday, they'd sneak on out the back door, get back to their villages, back to their farms, and get on with their lives. I do want to say as well, a pretty fascinating thing that some people would do in terms of getting access to these status and commodity goods is some Native American women would take old church bells and use them as cooking pots. All right. So we see that in some cases, these indigenous peoples were using these tools of colonialism to their advantage to enhance their own lives. Many groups also use missions for political purposes. All right, they frequently served as diplomatic meeting grounds. They were kind of a safe space where representatives of different indigenous nations could meet up and either make alliances or settle disputes. Some indigenous groups also used missions very cleverly for different forms of political manipulation of their enemies. For example, there we can see is the Apaches helped the Spanish build a mission in San Saba, Texas. And the Spanish are thinking, oh, okay, yes, we've been so successful. We have these dutiful subjects helping us build our mission. But what they were doing is they were making it very clearly known to the Comanches who were prominent in that area that, hey, look, the Spanish are helping us here. They're providing us this mission, giving us shelter. We have an alliance with the Spanish, and they would make sure to leave their clothes outside of the missions and things like that to let the Comanches know that they were there. And the Comanches got pretty upset with the Spanish for providing refuge to the Apaches, and then they would come and raid these Spanish missions. All right. So basically, what they were doing there were pitting their two enemies, the Spanish and the Comanches, against each other. Very, very clever. So definitely all kinds of uses that indigenous peoples made of these missions and of Spanish colonization as a whole. There are very, very unfortunate aspects of all of this where there were things like the spread of disease, there was enslavement of masses of Native people, there was warfare and killing of Native American people, and I don't want to diminish any of that. Yet I do want to very much highlight the indigenous agency and power held by indigenous peoples in many cases during this period of Spanish colonization. Okay, so if we're going to sum up the historical significance of the mission system and the encomienda system, remember, historical significance, we're always looking for one of five simple things. It's either the first of something, the last of something, led to something else, an example of something else, or demonstrated something else. Don't make it any more complicated than it needs to be. One of those five simple things. And in this case, we need to consider what's going on here. Through both of these colonization systems, we have European Spaniards mixing with various nations of indigenous peoples. And they're sharing ideas with each other. They're adopting elements of each other's lifestyles. They're also, as happens when you have masses of people together for long periods of time, doing a whole lot of schooly pooping with each other. Right? Sometimes consensual, sometimes not. For example, in these missions, these Spanish clergymen were under vows of celibacy, meaning that they had agreed to go throughout the remainder of their lives without having any kind of sexual activity so that they could instead focus that energy toward giving devotion to God. Well, as evidence suggests, not all of these clergymen took their vows of celibacy quite as seriously as others, and some of them did have sexual relations with Indian women in these missions. Sometimes consensually, other times they forced themselves upon these women. And this would definitely also be an element of the encomienda system, as there were Spanish encomenderos coming into Native American societies, providing a sense of protection and care and a sense to the people who he was demanding tribute from. There's a lot of interaction there. Again, they're sharing ideas, culture with each other, and some of the men and women, both consensually and non consensually, were engaging in sexual activity with each other. And all this blending of cultures and sexual activity would in turn lead to the birth of new cultures and new peoples. All right. So to sum all that up, we can see that the encomienda and mission system were historically significant because they led to the mixing of peoples and cultures, and they led to the birth of new peoples and new cultures. Don't need to complicate it any more than that. So if you're writing an ID term about either the encomienda system or the mission system, that's a pretty safe bet for the historical significance. You can say that they were historically significant because they led to mixing of cultures and peoples and led to the birth of new cultures and new peoples. So I do want us to understand that the Spanish were not just this big, unified colonizing force. There was a lot of conflict and division within the Spanish American Empire. One clear example we can see of this division within Spanish American society is the Sistema de las Castas, which was the Spanish caste system. All right, so this very clearly divided members of Spanish society in terms of status, wealth, and economic opportunities based on their ethnicity and their birthplace. So those with the most economic opportunities at the top of the social ladder, who earned the most respect in society, were individuals known as peninsulares. As we can see, that's very similar to the word peninsula, hinting that these are people from the Iberian Peninsula. Okay, these are people who were actually born in Spain. They were seen as superior to everybody else in society. Right under them were criollos or creoles, This refers to people who were born in New Spain, okay, meaning born in the Americas, but were of Spanish descent. These were usually the children of the Peninsulares. They were seen as always a little secondary to the people who were actually born over in Europe. And this is something that would transfer over to most European cultures. So in English society, for example, they had this same concept. George Washington, for example, would be looked at by people born in England as a backwards country bumpkin hillbilly because he was born in Virginia rather than in England. But still, Criollos in Spanish American society did tend to have a good bit of economic opportunity and a good bit of status in society, just not quite as much as Peninsulares. Under them were mestizos. These were the people we were discussing, born out of the interaction of the Spanish and Native Americans. These are people of mixed Spanish and Native American ancestry. Under them were the Indios and the Africos, meaning American Indians and Africans, both of which, contrary to what the chart hints here, were frequently enslaved by these other groups of people here. And as we see, there's a highest number of Indios and Africos, highest number of enslaved people, smallest number of peninsulares, but power, status, and tribute flowed upward toward those in the least populous class within the Spanish American colonies. There's clear division here all along the way. Okay, so these were the people who would have high political positions, maybe have important roles in missions. Criollos would be maybe lower level government officials, frequently would be priests, people of importance. Both of these classes here could be perhaps encomenderos. Peninsulares would probably at first pick over Criollos. And then all these other groups are kind of seen as subjects to these higher classes here. And this would lead to a good deal of conflict within Spanish society as this group began to shrink and these other groups began to grow. For example, this kind of division here, based on ethnicity and birthplace, would be one of the root causes of the Mexican War for Independence later down the road. Another place that there was consistent conflict within the Spanish Empire was between the religious forces and the secular forces. Secular meaning non-religious, so the political leaders, the military forces. They frequently saw that they needed to do what they needed to do in order to spread their dominance and assert Spanish sovereignty within colonial America, even if that meant bending the rules of the church a little bit. The clergy frequently found themselves at odds with these guys, saying, what you're doing is a violation of our Christian faith. Not always, unfortunately. Some of the religious figures were quite on board with what these guys were doing. Some of them were encomenderos themselves and allowing all kinds of horrible things to happen to indigenous peoples. Some of them, as I suggested, forced themselves onto Native American women, for example, took advantage of their vulnerable state in some cases in the missions. But there were several members of the Spanish clergy who found themselves at odds with those of the more secular forces within Spanish America. Clear example we can see is Bartolome de las Casas, who you guys should know a little bit about by now. He wrote these two books, History of the Indies and A Short Account of the Destruction of the Indies. And I had asked you guys who the intended audience of these sources were. And I do want to quickly show you that should not have been any kind of trick question or required you to do a whole lot of thinking. Great opportunity for us to see something we really need to look out for when we're looking at primary sources. So if we find the primary source written by Bartolome de las Casas, pop that on open. Always, if you have any kind of introductory information like this, read that. That is a very important thing to do, not only in history, but in all kinds of texts. If you have any kind of abstract, introduction, prologue, any kind of text like that, you want to read carefully. That's going to give you some of the key information you need for the rest of what's going on there. If we read the very first line here of this introduction, Bartolome de las Casas, a Dominican priest, wrote directly to the King of Spain, hoping for new laws to prevent brutal exploitation of Native Americans. Okay, so that's his purpose here with these writings, is to try to draw awareness to the King of Spain, saying, look, I know you're all the way over in Europe. You're not seeing what's happening here on the ground in Spanish North America, but there's all kinds of violations of our Christian doctrines here. And I need you to do something about this. This also tells us a key piece of information we're going to get to in a minute here, that his writings would be used by other European nations to justify their own conquest and colonization of the Americas later down the road. This is definitely a helpful tip for primary sources, but even things like monographs or articles. If you have an introduction, prologue, or abstract, read that carefully. that's going to be your best friend for guiding you through the rest of the thing. And honestly, by doing that, in a lot of cases, you can just skim through the rest of it because you know generally what's going on. You're just looking for mainly evidence or examples to back up what you already know is going to be coming out of this thing based on what you read in that introduction or abstract or whatever. Okay, but this guy's writing these accounts of what he's seeing around him. In some cases, it seems some of them are perhaps a bit exaggerated, but he was doing that to really try to grab the king's attention and let him know what we are doing here is not okay. He definitely saw that what the Spanish were doing to indigenous peoples was unjust and really a violation of Christian principles. He wanted to see an end to the enslavement of indigenous peoples. Early on, he had advocated replacing them with enslaved Africans. Little strange logic he had going there, but he eventually realized the absurdity of that logic throughout his life and just came to oppose slavery as an institution altogether. And as he was drawing attention to the harsh nature of things like the encomienda system and the slavery of indigenous peoples, he was faced with a lot of pushback, especially from prominent secular forces. Because all these people throughout Spanish North America were profiting from the encomienda system. They loved having that free labor source there at their disposal. And they were afraid that if De las Casas had too much influence to the Spanish monarchy with these writings, that they might bring things like the encomienda system to an end and they'd no longer be able to profit from them. So let's consider the legacies of De las Casas' writings. And when we're talking about the legacy, we're talking about what these led to long term, right? Their long term impacts. Sounds like whatever is included here would be pretty historically significant and worth keeping careful note of. So, on one hand, these did lead to the gradual decline of the encomienda system. There was a series of laws passed that brought first restrictions to the encomienda system, then eventually banned it outright. This system was replaced later down the road, though, with what was known as the repartimiento system. Under the repartimiento system, there was kind of a lottery drawn where certain indigenous peoples would be drafted to go work on certain labor projects for the Spanish Empire. So they were still contributing to the building of the Spanish Empire through their labor. There was more of a temporary type of labor, and they still had a sense of freedom when they were not being required to go and work. His writings, however, also unintentionally kicked off what was known as the Black Legend. This ties into the second part of that introduction of the primary source we were talking about. The Black Legend refers to propaganda used by Spain's colonial rivals, especially England, to justify their own colonization in the Americas. The Black Legend was propaganda that tried to not only highlight, but in many cases exaggerate, Spain's treatment of indigenous peoples in colonial America. They would say, look, we have writings here from this guy, Bartolome de las Casas, that show us the Spanish are being very inhumane in their treatment of the people there in the Americas. So we have an obligation to go in and colonize, quote unquote, the right way. We need to prevent the Spanish from expanding any further so that we can provide a more humanitarian means of colonization. So we can see ultimately that the Black Legend led to further European colonization, okay? Or we can say that it led to the justification by Spain's colonial rivals to also colonize in the Americas. As we're going to see, though, the Black Legend was really nothing more than a big load of malarkey, we'll say. People like the English aren't really going to treat the indigenous peoples here in the Americas any better than the Spanish had. We'll save that for a future lecture. We see here, though, two major legacies of De las Casas' writings, which are a byproduct of this conflict between religious forces like De las Casas and the secular forces who were really trying to drive the encomienda system and profit from it. Another major point of contention the Spanish faced in North America was not necessarily within their own empire, but in their conflicts with indigenous people. They were constantly grappling with indigenous power. While there are some very devastating impacts of European colonialism in the Americas, if we examine the evidence closely, we can see that in several cases, they had an upper hand over Europeans. And also, in a lot of cases, they kind of called the shots of how colonization went, who could colonize where, how well they could succeed. A lot of that also, as I suggested, depended very heavily on how Europeans approached Native Americans, whether it was through diplomacy or warfare, and how effective they were to each end would really determine the success of their colonial efforts. Clear example we can see of Spain having to grapple with indigenous power, though, is through the Pueblo revolts. Quick recap on this. You guys read a little bit about this, but what we saw here was this colony of New Mexico had been failing miserably, and a lot of people were suggesting, well, there's nothing valuable here. This colony is a big drain in our wallet. We need to shut it down. But the missionaries said, no, 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 we're having good success here. Don't shut us down. We need to keep saving souls here. Again, that shows us perhaps an example of that conflict within the empire there between the secular and religious forces. But the crown agreed and they ended up keeping the colonies because the missions were pretty successful here. However, despite their seeming success, by 1680, these various communities of indigenous peoples, referred to collectively by the Spanish as pueblos, combined their forces and led an all out assault against Spanish settlements here in Santa Fe, New Mexico, destroying churches, killing priests, destroying religious artifacts, all kinds of symbolic and material damage there done right. But you guys read various accounts explaining the basis of this Pueblo revolt. So, what I'd like you to do for your next lecture activity is to find in the lecture activity module the Pueblo revolt discussion. And I'd like you guys to discuss generally what you've come to understand as the cause of the Pueblo revolt, according to the source that you were assigned to read. And then you were going to respond to somebody who was assigned the opposite source, right? So in your initial post, you need to say something like, I was assigned the source by Bowden, and then you need to tell us generally what he said the cause of the Pueblo revolt was. Bowden suggested that the primary cause of the Pueblo revolt was XYZ. Okay. And then you can follow up with that with any evidence you think in a sentence or two that you think kind of sums up the key points of his argument there. All right. And then somebody else who had read the Garner essay would come in and say, interesting. This is much different than what I read in the Garner essay. Okay. In the Garner essay, he suggested that the cause of the Pueblo revolt was XYZ. He sees differences in this regard. All right. And I want you guys to just kind of get in conversation here, seeing the differences between how these different historians explain this same event. All right. Explain why, for example, religious figures and religious artifacts were targeted within this revolt, because they provide very different explanations for that in each of the sources. So again, your goal is to create an initial discussion post and then to respond to one of your classmates, at least one of your classmates, who was assigned the opposite source from you. Your post should be all about, according to the source you read, what was the primary cause of the Pueblo revolt? And how do their explanations differ from one another? What are y'all getting out of this? Just get in discussion here. Please be sure that you're using college level writing. All I mean by that is simply taking the time to do basic things like capitalize the first letter of the first word of each sentence, end your sentences with punctuation, make sure your sentences are complete sentences and that they make sense. Okay. Don't just write little brief BS text messages to each other to try to get this over with. Show me quality discussion based on what you got out of the reading. All right. Go ahead and pause, work on that, then jump back on. So hopefully you guys had a quality discussion there. That should give you an idea of what I mean when I say that the study of history is a series of interpretations that help us understand and explain the human past, not just what happened in the past. Neither of these historians were arguing about what happened. They agree on that pretty solidly, but based on what evidence they were evaluating and how they interpreted that evidence, they provided different explanations for the cause of the Pueblo revolt. By the way, I do want to, on a side note, let you guys know that those readings you looked at from the Pueblo revolt are just two of several examples. I pulled those from a whole book full of historians offering their explanation for what caused the Pueblo revolt. Another interesting cause that I had hinted at somewhat in our first lecture is that oral legends of the Pueblo people suggest that their ancestors had abandoned their thriving homeland of Chaco Canyon, largely as a result of a few individuals becoming so wealthy at everybody else's expense. And that caused them to adopt these very egalitarian lifestyles where everybody lived about the same materially, and they didn't like anybody getting too much wealth at anybody else's expense. And perhaps what we see here with the Pueblo revolt is these egalitarian people, with that ingrained in their history, are starting to see the Spanish try to flex their riches and try to assert authority over everybody else. And they responded by crippling their sense of power by attacking their religious symbols and their religious figures who were the focal point of their empire. Clear example there of how history works, all right? If we were considering the significance, though, of the Pueblo Revolt, I think there are several different things that we could say here. One key thing that we haven't necessarily discussed word for word, but that was noted in your readings, is that this was a successful revolt, okay? And it was significant because it led to the Spanish being kicked out of Santa Fe, all right, being expelled from Santa Fe for over 10 years. Just so you guys know, by the time they came back, they kind of learned their lesson and they tried to be a lot more accommodating to the indigenous peoples of the region and try to find some common ground with them. And from there, they kind of reestablished their presence in Santa Fe very gradually. Another thing we can see here, though, is based on the readings you've done and the discussions you've had, this is a clear example or demonstration of conflicting historical interpretation. Lastly, we can also see that it's a clear example of indigenous power in colonial North America. Right? Or we could also even say more specifically here, it's an example of Spain grappling with indigenous power in colonial North America. What I'm trying to get us to understand here is in a lot of cases, there's several different ways we could go about the historical significance based on what's provided here in the evidence. That also tells us we shouldn't have to go asking Google or ChatGPT what we should say because all the information we need is right here. All right, so this sums up Spanish colonization pretty briefly. We hit a lot of the main points. I think we can see a lot of the key impacts the Spanish colonization had on North America. If we consider some things from our previous lecture and in this lecture, we can see, for example, that Spain kicked off the Columbian Exchange. And as a result of that Columbian Exchange, they introduced things like horses to North America, which greatly transformed the ways of life for several groups of Native Americans. We can also see that they created systems of forced labor. For example, that we can see is the encomienda system and later the repartimiento system. We can see that they brought Christianity to North America through their various missionary efforts. We can also see that the establishment of missions had a big impact on North America. Right, it provided spaces for Native Americans to seek refuge in some cases, to practice politics in some cases, and to go and learn about different cultures, different religions. And both of these labor systems and the mission system led to the creation of new peoples and new cultures as there was a mixing of cultures and peoples. We can also see clear examples of indigenous power within Spanish North America in things like the way that some of these Native Americans did use the missions to their advantage. Also, in they're calling the shots of colonization here in making the decision to carry out this Pueblo revolt when they felt that Spain had overstayed their welcome and overstepped their authority here in colonial New Mexico. All right, so all of those impacts are things that we should definitely be mindful of as we move forward and may be very helpful for, I don't know, perhaps an exam essay prompt. Just throwing that out there. So let's take a look now at French colonization in North America and see how it compared to Spanish colonization. So early on, France had a few failed attempts at getting a foothold in North America. So their original motivations for coming to North America were similar to the Spanish's unintentional reason for showing up in North America, and that is that they were trying to tap into trade with Asia. They were convinced that far up in North America, there was this waterway that would lead them to Asia. So basically, they were looking for a shortcut to Asia, referred to as the Northwest Passage. As it turns out, there was no such waterway, but several European expeditions from both France and later down the road England would come searching for this Northwest Passage. France also had some small colonial ventures down in the southeast, establishing some ports to thwart off Spanish colonization and also to rob Spanish ships. But before they could really move much further beyond these few forts that they'd established, they got preoccupied with some other issues going on in Europe. There were some religious wars that occupied the bulk of their time and resources. So they had to abandon these early colonial measures and kind of retreat away from their colonization for quite some time. But later down the road, a French explorer named Samuel Champlain, I am very sure that I mispronounced that. Pardon my French. But he came in and established the first permanent French settlement in North America, which was Quebec. From there, they kind of expanded out a little further and established this whole area of New France, again, here in Eastern Canada, down into the Great Lakes region. And in this colonial venture, where they're actually establishing colonies and actually getting people over here, their primary motivation was not to establish large scale settlements, okay? They were there to trade. They were very invested in tapping into very profitable fur trades that indigenous peoples in this region had well established long before they arrived. So they began establishing things like trading posts and forts. And as a result of being there for more economic interest rather than looking for large scale settlement, the French came in much smaller numbers. Because they had lower numbers and because they were interested in diplomacy and trade, they tended to have overall more amicable relations with Native Americans, certainly than the Spanish did, and than the English would moving forward as well. That's not to say everything was always honky dory standing around a campfire singing kumbaya between the French and Native Americans, just saying overall the relations were far more friendly than those that Native Americans faced with Spanish colonizers and English colonizers. To this end, what we really kind of saw in colonial France was the establishment of what a historian named Richard White describes as the middle ground. And the middle ground refers to a metaphorical meeting space of peoples who are coming together and sharing certain aspects of each other's cultures. And this requires each side being willing to compromise certain aspects of their cultures in order to accommodate one another. And in the process of trying to accommodate one another, it's almost inevitable that there will be some kind of creation of new aspects of culture that had not existed on either side before. Okay, so again, this is both sides adopting elements of each other's culture, but also adopting new customs and new aspects of culture that neither side had practiced before in order to try to accommodate one another. Clear example we can see of how this worked is by viewing a clip from a great film from my childhood, A Bug's Life. So what we'll see here in this clip is a middle ground essentially being formed between a colony of ants and some circus bugs. We'll go ahead and let you guys review the clip, and then we'll discuss how this demonstrates some key points of the middle ground.
This works?
Great. One success. I'm never gonna make a difference.
Me neither. I'm a royal ant and I can't even fly yet. I'm too little.
Oh, being little's not such a bad thing.
Yes, it is.
No, it's not.
It's two.
Is not.
It's two.
Is not.
It's
It's
two.
not.
It's
It's not.
two.
It's not. It's not. Oh, a seed. I need a seed. Here. Pretend that that's a seed.
It's a rock.
Oh, I know it's a rock. I know, but let's just pretend for a minute that it's a seed, all right? We'll just use our imaginations. Now, do you see our tree? Everything that made that giant tree is already contained inside this tiny little seed. All it needs is some time, a little bit of sunshine and rain, and voila!
This rock will be a tree.
Seed to tree. You've got to work with me here, all right? Okay. Now, you might not feel like you can do much now, but that's just because, well, you're not a tree yet. You just have to give yourself some time. You're still a seed.
But it's a rock.
I know it's a rock! Don't you think I know a rock when I see a rock? I've spent a lot of time around rocks!
Pretend it's a seed, okay?
Thanks, Todd.
Hey, what's with the rock?
Must be an ant thing. And to you, Princess Atta, you have given us so much. Please accept this gift from us bugs to you ants.
For you.
Oh, it's a rock.
What's with the rock? Must be a circus thing.
All right, so what we saw there was very much a metaphor for the types of things that happened between French colonists and Native Americans as they forged that middle ground. They were trying to adopt elements of each other's culture to accommodate one another, and they often misinterpreted the meaning of certain things that they witnessed and would amplify them, blow them out of proportion, and adopt in turn new traditions and new elements of culture that had never previously existed. What we saw in the clip was there was a very specific meaning behind the rock between those two particular ants. And the circus bugs, trying to impress the ants, misinterpreted the meaning of that rock and presented it to the princess of the ant colony, thinking it had some kind of special meaning to all ants as a whole. And the ants just kind of accepted and said, okay, thank you. Um, so it became a misunderstanding of that this must be a circus thing, right? It became this kind of tradition of giving a rock as some kind of symbol that now has some kind of meaning that that never would have had before. Very similar to the types of customs that were developed as Native Americans and French colonists were accommodating each other in order to forge this middle ground. By the way, that whole aspect of Flick, the main character, trying to give a big, meaningful life lesson to the little princess Aunt Dot about being a seed that will one day grow into a great tree, and all she gets out of it is that it's not actually a seed but a rock. Sometimes that's how teaching college students fails. I digress. Now let's look at some examples of how this middle ground was forged. One example of the middle ground is certainly the fur trade. Europeans were providing metals, guns, and tools to indigenous peoples in exchange for these very valuable fur pelts. Meeting each other on a common ground there, trying to find common grounds of trade rather than one group trying to dictate the terms of trade. It was later down the road when the French would try to dictate the terms of trade here that the middle ground would be broken and the English would be able to tap into this a little more. By the way, I do want us to understand that all European empires present in North America were engaged in some extent to the fur trade. The French were just the most heavily involved. I also want us to understand that there had been a long-standing fur trade between various groups of indigenous peoples, but the demands that Europeans placed for these furs led to this fur trade to be far more extensive than it had been before the colonial period. Another example of the middle ground was intermarriage between French colonists and indigenous peoples. The French were far more willing than the Spanish had been early on to intermarry. We need to understand that marriage was key to forming full on alliances with indigenous peoples. Okay, they saw this as a key way to bring colonists into their kinship networks and therefore have more firm alliances with them. So, as a result, the French were able to form more diplomatic alliances with indigenous peoples than the Spanish were early on. The Spanish, we need to understand, were prominently Franciscans who were unable to marry as part of their religious order. And then a lot of the secular Spaniards early on saw themselves as above marrying indigenous peoples who they considered to be quote unquote savages. Now, they would get over that later down the road, and there would be some intermarriage between Spaniards and indigenous peoples, but the French wasted no time forging the middle ground in this regard. Another clear example is through the French approach toward missionary work and spreading religion to the indigenous peoples. The order of French missionaries, known as the Jesuits or the Society of Jesus, operated far differently than the Franciscans we saw in the Spanish Empire. There were some Jesuits in the Spanish Empire as well, but even they worked a bit differently than these here in New France. While the Spanish had these walled-in mission compounds that we saw where they were bringing in indigenous peoples and forcing them to adopt elements of Spanish cultures, trying to get them to assimilate into Spanish cultures, tearing down their belief systems and forcing them to replace them with their Roman Catholic beliefs, the Jesuits here in the French Empire would actually go and live among indigenous peoples in their communities and adopt elements of their cultures, try to learn their religions, try to learn their customs, and try to find common grounds through which they could have conversations about religion. Very much more reflective of a middle ground. So, what were some of the key impacts and results of French colonization and of this middle ground? What we're going to see here pretty much is the historical significance of the middle ground, right? We see on one hand it led to the mixing of cultures and peoples, but it also led to the birth of new cultures and new peoples. That was a very key aspect of the middle ground, right? That's what we saw a metaphor for in that clip from A Bug's Life. But I'm not going to sit here and say that all was willy-nilly in French colonization. I'm not going to sell you the black legend and make you think that the Spanish were these horrible people and the French were so much more valiant and humanitarian, because there were several aspects of French colonization that had severe and lasting negative impacts on indigenous peoples as well. So, for example, like all Europeans colonizing in North America, the French did contribute to this severe disease spread among indigenous peoples, which was detrimental to them and led to a huge decline in indigenous peoples' population. Furthermore, we need to consider some of the less positive aspects of the fur trade. In exchange for the valuable furs that the French were receiving, they were providing Native Americans with metal tools and weapons, as well as guns, alongside hard spirits. Okay, and we need to understand that indigenous peoples, for quite some time, had been fermenting different types of fruits and plants and creating various intoxicating beverages. But that's quite a bit different than getting a hold of straight up whiskey or rum or something like that. And I don't think I really need to sit here and explain why it could be dangerous for a civilization of people to get access for the first time in their lives in large numbers, guns, metal tools, metal weapons, and hard spirits. Look here at this picture. All right, we got people passing out all over the place, swinging around hatchets. Very dangerous. All right. So this did definitely lead somewhat to uh, destruction of social well-being in some of these indigenous societies. Furthermore, it led to a breakdown of skill and an increased dependency on trade. As many of these indigenous societies became more dependent on guns and metal tools that they were gaining from the fur trade, they began to use them to replace their skills that they had used to survive for generations. And then, therefore, they stopped teaching those kinds of skills to the younger generations, so these skills would ultimately be lost to entire civilizations of people as this increased dependence on trade became prevalent. Okay, the fur trade also led to overhunting, which had some severe environmental impacts. Again, there had been hunting by indigenous peoples for generations. This fur trade had been active to some extent for generations, but the high demand placed by the French would lead to severe overhunting that would have all kinds of tremendous impacts on the environment in North America. A clear example we can look at is the near extinction of the North American beaver, right? The beaver was nearly hunted to extinction in order to fuel this fur trade. And we got to consider where beavers live and what it is that they do. They chomp on trees to get big old logs to build dams, and those dams control the flow of rivers, right? So if there's not beavers around chopping down trees and not changing the course of rivers, that's going to have impacts on the flow of water, where it goes, how much water flows where, how much water does not flow where. That's also going to impact all the fish living in the water, all the plants growing in the water. Also going to impact any animals who go to drink from that water. Also going to impact people who go to certain spots to hunt the animals where they know they'll be drinking from that water. Also impacting animals who hunt the animals who are drinking from the water. The entire ecosystem is starting to get kind of thrown off because these beavers are getting so low in number in order to get these pelts for the fur trade. Furthermore, we can see from the beaver that this fur trade could, in some cases, lead to warfare between various groups of Europeans as well as various indigenous nations. So, for example, there was this big conflict fought between the French, the Dutch, and their indigenous allies on either side, known as, wait for it, the Beaver Wars. Yes, there was a war called the Beaver Wars, where they're fighting for control of various hunting grounds to hunt beavers. You cannot make some of this stuff up. Why was all this happening? We're talking about destruction of societies. We're talking about increased alcoholism. We're talking about loss of skill, dependency on trade, um, warfare. Why? So that the French could have these nice, fancy, warm, insulated hats made out of beaver fur. So we've looked at the French a little less than we did the Spanish, but that's not to suggest that their impacts on North American history are any less significant. Okay. On one hand, we saw that they helped forge a middle ground, which helped create the birth of new cultures and new peoples. There was intermarriage between the French and Native Americans. There was perhaps on some level more successful introduction of Christianity, or at least certain elements of Christianity, to certain Native American groups through the middle ground tactics of the Jesuits. And then we saw all these impacts of the fur trade, both positive and negative, making life a little easier for indigenous peoples to some extent, providing them things like metal tools and guns that can be useful for hunting, doing certain types of work. But it also led to an increased dependence on trade and a breakdown of skill. Also saw the severe environmental impacts as certain animals like the beaver were hunted to near extinction. in order to fuel the French trade so they could wear these nice comfy hats and have fur coats, etc. So definitely significant impacts from French colonization in North America as well. Keep these things in mind as we move forward. Moving forward, we'll go ahead and start looking at early English colonization, seeing how it compares to the colonization from these two empires here. From there, we'll see how they all kind of come together. But for now, we're going to wrap this up here. Please let me know if you have any questions. Otherwise, this is it. Over and out.